Welcome back to Being the Head. I'm Jacqui.
And I'm Jane, and today we're kicking off a short, sharp series of mini episodes designed for one thing: to give you a genuine thinking space as we approach the launch of the new September 2026 inspection toolkit. It's no 5-step checklists, no platitudes, just a space to test your own judgment.
We know where your headspace is right now. It's July, the school gates are barely closed, but your mind is already in September. You're looking at the new toolkit, and if we're honest, the old inspection anxiety is whispering in your ear, tempting you to dress up a performance.
And today we're going to be talking about inclusion, and we're going to name the elephant in the room straight away: the Inclusive Mainstream Fund. If personal well-being simply acts as a plaster, the leader eventually absorbs the structural strain. But as we head towards September, we are facing an entirely new landscape. Under the school's white paper, every mainstream school in England will receive the Inclusive Mainstream Fund, a ring-fenced grant over £400 million per year. And this isn't a standalone SEND budget. It's a system-wide shift to make inclusion a structural reality rather than an individual burden.
Exactly, Jane, and the funding has landed this summer, but the true test begins in September. By the 31st of December 2026, every mainstream state school in England must publish a formal inclusion strategy on their website. This is a statutory duty, not a recommendation. If you don't have a plan to meet this by December, you're exposing your school to immediate scrutiny from governors and Ofsted, who are already evaluating whether your school is inclusive by design under the renewed Secure Fit inspection framework.
And the question is, let me do that again. And the question we want you to reflect on today is: are you using that strategy to design a cohesive system, or are you just writing a beautifully formatted document to satisfy an inspector?
So, to ensure the IMF isn't treated as another administrative task to survive, we need to approach it with a structural clarity. Here is where your leadership focus must sit as the schools reopen.
So firstly, map your provision against the 7 DfE Inclusion Themes. Your upcoming inclusion strategy must explicitly demonstrate how you address the 7 statutory themes, which are ambitious leadership and governance, evidence-based early intervention, high-quality adaptive teaching, accessible enrichment beyond the classroom, safe, respectful culture and belonging, strong partnerships with families and services, and inclusive and accessible environments.
And second, focus on universal evidence-based provision first. The DfE's guidance is clear. The IMF is designed to provide every early support without needing a formal diagnosis or EHCP. Invest September's allocations into scalable, whole school interventions such as speech and language screening, staff neuroinclusion training, and robust universal assessments to catch barriers before they escalate.
Third, know your strict spending boundaries. Safeguard your budget by knowing what the IMF cannot be spent on. So remember, no general running school costs or operational deficits, no subsidising pre-existing activities. It must fund new or strengthened inclusive practice, and no capital building works or unrelated staff hours.
And finally, educate your governing body. Governors must be prepared to oversee this funding. They should not just ask, where is the money going, but rather, how does your IMF allocation directly reduce barriers to attendance and achievement for the most vulnerable cohorts and how are we measuring that impact?
So under the new framework, the focus has shifted from verdicts to conversations. Inspectors aren't looking to catch you out, they want to see the impact of your systems. So let's test your system. If an inspector walks into your school in September and looks at your most vulnerable cohorts, what will they actually see?
If they see a SEND pupil sitting at the back of a mainstream classroom doing an entirely different, simplified worksheet while a teaching assistant does the thinking for them, that is not inclusion. That's physical integration, but cognitive isolation.
Exactly. And that is where the human cost sits. When inclusion isn't structural, we rely on individual teachers, and we expect a teacher with 30 children, 4 of whom have complex competing needs, to magically adapt every lesson on the hop with no cognitive to magically adapt every lesson on the fly with no cognitive load relief. And that is a recipe for burnout, not equity.
And yet, let's be clear about how inspectors are going to test this. They aren't just looking for your paperwork or chatting with you in the office. They're going to select specific pupils, particularly those with SEND or receiving IMF supported interventions, and they're going to shadow them. And they will follow their day step by step to see how robust and consistently your school adapts to their specific needs from lesson to lesson.
This is pupil shadowing, and it's the ultimate stress test for your culture. It bypasses the performance theatre because you cannot script a vulnerable child's entire Tuesday or Wednesday. And under the strong standard in the Toolkit, it talks about strategies being systemically and skillfully adjusted. It's about the graduated approach. Assess, plan, do, review.
So here's a question I want you to ask your leadership team this week. Where has your review phase led to a skillful adjustment of a strategy that simply wasn't working? Can you show that pivot point? Can you show the point to a popular, expensive intervention that you actually stopped because the qualitative data showed it wasn't making a sustained difference?
So let's be practical, and we're not going to give you the answers because each context is unique. But what we are going to give you are diagnostic questions to take to your next SLT thinking space.
So my first question is about the IMF allocation. So I would ask, how does your published inclusion strategy explicitly prove that your inclusive mainstream fund allocation is directly reducing daily barriers for your current cohorts, rather than just filling historic budget deficits? If you've just absorbed that ring-fence funding to keep your head above water financially, the system is still broken. How are you proving the direct link to classroom experience?
And the second question we want you to think about is about your SENCO or Inclusion Lead's authority. So the question is, when your SENCO or Inclusion Lead identifies a systemic weakness in mainstream classroom adaptations, what formal non-negotiable mechanism exists for them to challenge and upskill those specific staff members? If your SENCO or Inclusion Lead is buried under EHCP paperwork and doesn't have that structural authority to drive pedagogical improvement across departments or the school, they are merely a coordinator in name only.
Okay, so here's another question. This is question 3, and this is about if you have an inclusion base. How do you track and quality assure the percentage of time pupils in your inclusion base spend in meaningful, successful participation with their mainstream peers. Is that base a revolving door into the classroom, or has it become a permanent parallel school within your building?
And the final question is around pupils' voice. So when inspectors shadow these pupils and sit next to them in class, they're going to ask them questions directly to test if your adaptations are actually felt by the child or young person. So, have you asked your children, young people, these questions? Question number 1. How does your teacher help you when you get stuck on a difficult task? Can you show me where you've improved your work because of feedback? And do you feel like you're doing the same learning as everyone else here, or does it feel totally different?
So if your pupils' answers don't match the intent of your beautifully bound SEND policy, the inspectors will spot that disconnect immediately. Coherence isn't what is written, it is what it's lived in your school.
So if you can answer those 4 questions honestly, you don't need to prepare for inspection. You are already running a reflective, highly coherent school.
And remember, the new Toolkit explicitly says inspectors do not need information to be presented in any specific format. We do not need leaders to produce documents specifically for an inspection. Do not spend your summer creating folders for Ofsted. Spend your time building psychological safety for your staff, clarifying your systems and protecting your own headspace.
Exactly, because wellbeing isn't an add-on. It is the infrastructure that allows inclusion to happen in the first place.
For a more comprehensive look at the self-evaluating tool that we've designed to test out your school's inclusive policy, subscribe to our kit page for an overview of this podcast and link with us on LinkedIn, but also email us at beingthehead@gmail.com, beingthehead@gmail.com, because we see you, we hear you. Enjoy your break, and we'll be back next week to look at curriculum and teaching under the new lens. Until then, take care of yourself.